Growing up, I wasn't a fan of roller coasters. When I was real little, I think that's an obvious thing, is to not necessarily like roller coasters. I've since gotten over that fear mostly. Now, my sister, she would always ride roller coasters with my dad, while my mom and I would sit and do smaller, safer rides that are on the ground. But it wasn't until about middle school and high school when we started having field trips to amusement parks that I eventually got over my fear of roller coasters. I was in 8th grade, and we were at, I believe it was Six Flags at the time. And there, they had a brand new roller coaster. X-Force, I believe, is what it was called. This was no ordinary roller coaster, mind you. This was one where you were flying. Not in a literal sense, but in more of a figurative sense. Because what they do is, when you got on this roller coaster, you kind of leaned back in this chair, and they strap you down, and they strap you in, and pull everything tight and whatnot. And then the seat slowly lays down. And you go up the hill on your back. And you can look to your sides and see how high up you are, and it's quite calming. And then, as you approach the first hill, you turn. And you are now face down, going down this hill, ridiculously fast. There are loops, there are twists, there are turns, all of it meant to give one the experience of flight. It was both terrifying but amazing at the same time. I realize now that when I got on that, I was putting my faith in this machine. I was firmly hoping and believing that everything was going to be fine. That all of the things would stay connected, that pieces of the track wouldn't come off, that all of these things would happen, that we constantly hear about these malfunctions at different carnivals and different parks, right? You know, the stories that make the news are the ones where the people get stuck on the roller coaster, or when someone gets hurt on a ride. And those are always in the back of my mind, looking at these different roller coasters, having this little seed of doubt. I went to one in a place called Kennywood. I rode the Steel Phantom's Revenge. That coaster is not built for the husky gentleman. I sat down in there, I poured myself into there next to my wife, and they pushed it down and it clicked. Okay, it clicked. That's a good thing, right? The guy came along and stepped on it and pushed it down a little bit more. And this one didn't have loops. But what it did have was big drops. And what I did in the midst of that was fly about a foot out of my seat the entire time going over these hills, terrified that I was going to fly off of this thing. My poor wife grabbing me and pulling me back down into the seat. And I said, ain't no way I'm ever riding that coaster again. But it worked. The things that were supposed to happen, happened. But still to this day, I am terrified of that one particular roller coaster and will never put my faith and trust in that again. You see, and that's what we as people do. We want to put our hope and our faith and trust in something that's authentic, that's concrete, right? Like we want to have all of the knowledge that we possibly can. I mean, I wore my Cleveland Browns tie today for a reason, to make this point, that every year, almost every Cleveland Browns fan will say the same thing. This is our year. It ain't funny. That wasn't a joke. That one wasn't one of the jokes. But that's what Cleveland Browns fans do every year. This is going to be our year. And they hope against hope, regardless of what anyone else is saying, that this is going to be the year. But I would like to think that some of us are rational and we think we just talk a big game. Because there's always that little specter of doubt, that little seed of doubt. And that's true for each and every one of us, that we are not built to understand things unless they're right in front of us. Unless we can see them clearly, unless they're physically in front of us and we have as much information and facts as possible, we are always going to have this tiny little bit in our brain that says, yeah, but what if? I've flown on airplanes. I like flying on airplanes. And yet every time I'm on an airplane, the moment we hit even the littlest bit of turbulence, my mind instantly says, okay, Lord, this is it. Receive me into your arms. And it doesn't matter if it lasts for a while or if it's just real quick. Because while I trust the giant metal tube flying thousands of miles in the air, while I trust the pilots, in the back of my mind, there's still this little voice, this nagging little voice that says, yeah, but what if? What if it's not like that? What if something goes wrong? How can you trust this when it makes no sense how this giant tube is flying through the air? And it's in those moments I found that my faith is not 100% in the thing that I am doing. I would like to say that this does not warrant itself to the promises of God, that we at all times have no doubts, but if I said that, I would be lying to you. Because the fact of the matter is, whether or not we want to admit it, whether or not we will vocalize it, there are times in our lives when we have doubts. Where we think, yeah, but what if? What if it's all hokum? What if it's not true? What if we're getting this wrong? And we don't voice those. No. Because we feel like we can't voice those. As if there's some deficiency inside of us, making us less of a follower of Jesus Christ because there are times when we doubt things. But we should know it, right? I mean, we look at the world, we see what God has done for us. We see all of these different things happening in our lives, and we know that these are things that God has intimately been involved in to bring us to the point of where we are today. Yeah, but what if? And it's always going to be there. Now, the challenge with that is to tell the voice, yeah, okay, you shut up now. Because I'm believing in Hebrews 11:1. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. That's what faith is. And you can't talk about doubt without talking about faith. Because at the end of the day, that's what we have, is faith. I have faith that the plane will arrive me safely to my destination. I have faith that the roller coaster straps will keep me down and I won't go flying off. I have faith that Baker Mayfield is going to lead the Cleveland Browns to a Super Bowl victory this year, even though please, God, let it happen. But these are all things that we have faith in. And we have faith in God. We have faith in God. And yet we find ourselves in a world where we don't always see God. Or when we see God at work, we think, is that really God's work? Because, I can explain this whole thing away. And when we look at our Old Testament reading, our Old Testament text for today, we have a story of Abraham and Sarah. It's a wonderful story. Abraham, we know, the progenitor of the Israelite people, taken from the land of Ur and told to go somewhere else. And so he does that. No questions asked. God says, pick up your stuff and go, and he does it. I will show you the land I will give you. Okay, awesome, Abraham says, or Abram. It's not until later he becomes Abraham, where God takes him and changes his name. Eventually he keeps telling Abraham, he says, yeah, your son Your children, you're going to be the father of an entire dynasty. And Abraham's like, yes, Lord, I believe that. You are right. And his wife, Sarah, goes, yeah, this ain't working for us. And so Sarah has to get involved, and this is when we have the story of Hagar and Ishmael. And God has to come to Abraham and says, yeah, okay, funny thing, when I said you were going to have a son, I met with Sarah. So you need to trust me in this. And eventually, the story that we get to today is Abraham and God and some angels having a conversation. And in the midst of this, God says, Sarah is going to have a baby. And Sarah is snooping around the entrance of the tent where they are. And she hears this. And you know what she does? She takes stock in what the world is saying. She looks at things logically. She says, okay, let's think about this for a minute. My husband's old, and they were very old at this point. She says, my husband's very old. I'm very old. The things that were going on to help me conceive and show that I was able to bear children, all of that has stopped. Logically, she says, this cannot happen. The one thing, she says, that I've wanted more than anything, and now, after all of this is going on, after everything else is going on, where all signs point to no, she says, after this, I'm supposed to believe that this is going to happen. And she laughs. She laughs. And I'd like to say that this is not something that we do, because, we're Christians, right? We get it. We know about the promises of God, and yet this is exactly what we do. We live our lives at times saying we believe in God, and yet living our lives as if we don't. We accumulate stuff. We accumulate things. We accumulate wealth. We do all of these things that we shouldn't do. Well, I gotta save for a rainy day. Yeah, you do. But you don't have to squeeze 2 pennies so hard a nickel's gonna come out of them. We are told that God is going to provide for us so that we might be a blessing for others. But do we really believe that? Or are we like Sarah and say, yes, Lord, hear what you're saying, great idea, don't buy any of it for a minute. And there are many things that we do this with. Am I really good enough? Am I really forgiven? The whole Protestant Reformation started because Martin Luther was freaking out about his salvation. How can I know I'm saved? What if I'm not saved? What if I sin in the middle of the night and I haven't had time to go to the priest and confess my sins? And finally, the priest, his confessor, at one point famously says to Martin Luther, dude, call me when something interesting happens. That's what he said. He said, when you actually have a sin to confess, you can come back to me. Because he was so worried about his own salvation. He had this doubt of, am I really saved? It was that doubt that pushed him forward into something else. And you see, God hears this. And God calls Sarah out on this. He says, look, I get it. He says, why is she going to laugh? I totally see how ludicrous of an idea this is. And let's be honest, it is a ludicrous idea. He says, but, see, it's the other but here. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? He says, can I not do that? God says, I'm sorry, I had assumed that I was God Almighty. And Almighty meant Almighty, all-powerful, omnipotent, and perfect in all things, that I could do, whatever I need to do. And God knows this. He says, even this, that seems stupid, that seems illogical, that seems like it's going to be something that can't possibly happen, can I not do that? But of course God can do that. That's the point. You see, the problem is, the reason that we have doubts, the reason that we have fears, the reason that we have worries about God's power is because we are not listening to what God has said. Instead, what we're doing is we're taking stock of the things of this world, and we're trying to apply logic to something that at times is not 110% logical. It's just not. Case in point. When I was getting ready to go into seminary, after years of running from it and dreading it, my wife and I were in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, dropping off forms for student financial aid and things like that. It was our day off, as we both worked at the same place. We received a phone call that there was a mandatory paid meeting tomorrow that we had to attend. And in that moment, we were told the facility, it was a drug and alcohol rehab center for teens. It's faith-based. We were told that it's shutting down. And that soon and very soon, we would be out of a job. And this was after, a week later, I'd say, that we had just started a new car, paying on a new car. So what do we do? I looked at her and I said, honey, I get it. I'm going to put this on hold for a year or two. We'll find jobs. We'll deal with it then. She looked at me and said, that is the stupidest thing you have ever said, of which there are many. She's got such a way with words. But she said, it'll work out. Somehow, she's like, I don't know how. Somehow, it'll work out. But you're going to seminary. And I was like, well, darn, I just got my butt handed to me by my wife theologically, and that's supposed to be my job. I should probably listen to her. And it did. It worked out. It shouldn't have worked out because logically, two unemployed people living in Pittsburgh should not have worked out. But it did. It absolutely did. I mean, eventually we find employment and yada yada, all that good fun stuff. But logically, all signs pointed to no. But with God, God is able to do the impossible, to do the unthinkable, to do the improbable. These are the things that God does on a daily basis. But we don't believe it. And when we look at our New Testament reading, that's exactly what's going on with John the Baptist. Poor John the Baptist hanging out in jail. Why was John the Baptist in jail? For being John the Baptist. John the Baptist was a loudmouth. He told people off. He told them not what they wanted to hear, but what they needed to hear. The truth about things. And eventually he rubs people the wrong way, and he winds up in jail. And so he sends some of his disciples to Jesus with a simple question. Are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another? Because again, what he's seeing from his vantage point, from his myopic little worldview of being in jail and doing what he's supposed to do and yet being punished for it, by having these blinders on, he's only looking right in front of him and not looking at the bigger picture. Jesus answers the disciples, go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have the good news brought to them. All of these things that are going on, Jesus says, points to one inalienable truth, that I am the Messiah. Now, he doesn't come right out and say that. not at this point. He said, tell John what you see. Tell him exactly what's going on. And there is the proof. There's the proof. When we look at this world, and we know how messed up and terrifying it can be, and yet you see something so pure and so innocent that it can only come from God. There it is. When we see people disrupted by natural disasters, we see people hurting, and yet we see other people come alongside them to pick them up, to help them. There is your proof. Each and every one of us living today, exactly how we are in this moment, is proof. Because mathematically speaking, when you start talking about conception, when you start talking about sperm and egg and fertilization and all that, it is a mathematical impossibility that each and every one of us are exactly the way we are at any given point in time. And the same can be said about anyone, yet it is a miracle we see every day, and therefore something we discount. But there is the proof. The fact of the matter is, God has shown us God's mighty hand. Not in giant booming voices from the sky, not in doves that are flaming and flying about, not in loud trumpets coming out from the seas, or angels fluttering about our heads, but in the simple, everyday joy of human existence. But we see it every day, and so we just write it off. We don't talk about the complexities of the human circulation system or the endocrine system or the skin that we have. We don't talk about those complexities that are so crazy complicated. You have to have specialized doctors dealing with them. We don't talk about the fact that we as human beings are a sack of meat, our brain, piloting a giant meat-covered robot skeleton. Because that's what we are, but we don't talk about that. Because we're just people. And we don't think about the minutiae of it. We don't take the step back and say, look at what God has done. And so we doubt. And the fact of the matter is, it's okay to have doubts. It is okay to have questions. What is not okay is to wallow in it. What is not okay is to have our own blinders on and not look at the bigger picture, because that's what faith is. Faith is sitting back, stepping back and saying, this is the bigger picture. And while this over here may be horrible and I don't like it one bit, it works into the bigger picture, the grand scheme of things. You don't have to like it, that's fine. But I guarantee you that God is with you. Whether or not you're aware of it, whether or not you feel God's presence, I can assure you with every fiber in my being that God walks with you. So have your questions. It's fine. Just be honest about it. Because the only way we're going to resolve issues about things we don't understand or things that we're having a hard time comprehending is to talk about it. To not be silent about these things. To be honest and open with people that care about us. Because that is what this church is. This church is a group of people who love each other enough to hang out and learn about God. And the fact that they're here means that they are here not just for them, but for you all as well. That when you have a problem, when you have an issue, when you have a question, that you are a united body in Jesus Christ. And that is the difference that this church has. That we are a family of believers, able to help one another. But you got to speak up. Don't be quiet. Don't be silent about it. Be earnest. Be honest about it all. And know that no matter what, God loves you. More than you can possibly imagine, God loves you. Amen.